From the University of Tulsa, this is Sacred and Profane Love, a podcast that explores how literature, philosophy, and theology can help us think more deeply about love, happiness, and meaning in human life. I am Jennifer Frey, Dean of the Honors College at TU, and your host. I invite you to join me and my guests, which range from award-winning fiction writers, poets, and literary critics, to philosophers and scholars from a range of disciplines, as we explore in conversation how the enjoyment of art might be, as the late philosopher and novelist Iris Murdoch has so provocatively suggested, a training in the love of virtue. I hope these conversations will enrich your life, inspire you to crack open some good books, and bring your attention back to what ultimately matters in the end. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Sacred and Profane Love. This morning, I am joined by my colleague, Lars Engle. Lars is Chapman Professor of English at the University of Tulsa, where he has won the University Outstanding Teacher Award and the College Excellence in Teaching Prize. He also teaches at Breadloaf. He has had a Mellon Fellowship at the Center for Advanced Studies at the University of Virginia, and he has won the Hyman Prize for Outstanding Work in the Humanities at Yale. He is editor of English Renaissance Drama, a Norton anthology. He is a former trustee of the Shakespeare Association of America, and he is the author of Shakespearean Pragmatism, Market of His Time, studying Shakespeare's contemporaries, and most recently, an essay collection titled Shakespeare and Montaigne. Welcome to the podcast, Lars.
Thanks very much. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, I am glad to have you here as well. So you chose the poetry of John Donne for our discussion this morning. So my first question is the obvious one. Who was John Donne? What do we need to know about him to appreciate his poetry?
Yes, this is actually a complicated and really interesting question. Donne lived in the last 30 years of the 16th century and the first 30 years roughly of the 17th century in England, mostly in or around London. He is the great nephew of Sir Thomas More, or St. Thomas More, I should say, in this company. And he was raised as a Catholic. 11 members of his extended family died either by execution or in prison in some connection with their Catholic religion in Protestant England. And at the end of his life, he was Dean of St. Paul's in the Church of England. So a conversion, a transformation, a passage from Catholicism to Protestantism takes place in Donne's life. Mm-hmm. And tracing the evolution of that passage is one of the preoccupations of Donne biographers.
Now, is he the only one in his family to do that? Or did he sort of...
He was his mother remained a Catholic until her death, and she lived almost as long as Donne did. She actually lived with Donne and his family when he moved to the deanery of St. Paul's, when he finally had a house big enough to accommodate his family and relatives, though that was a somewhat delicate matter since she was still a Catholic, and she may have had her own qualms about living with a heretic. Donne is one of the great preachers in the English church in one of the great periods of preaching in the history of the Church of England. Mm-hmm. But in the context of this podcast, I think that the reason Donne is dear to English departments is probably what we should be talking about. He is arguably the greatest writer of love lyrics in English. The intensity, the variety, the humor, the originality of his lyrics, which I hope we'll have a chance to explore by listening to them a little bit later in the podcast, is extraordinary. And his love life, insofar as we can reconstruct it, is pretty fascinating as well. Donne was an extremely bright but not particularly well-heeled young man, and he was coming from a family that had quite a bit of money generations back that had all been taken away because they were Catholic. Mm-hmm. And so he had to make his way in the world by his wits. And he was also not permitted, because of his Catholicism, to take degrees in the English universities, though he did attend them. He attended Oxford for 3 years. And then, because it appeared that even very young students at Oxford were going to be asked to take the oath acknowledging the supremacy of the monarch over the church, which no Catholic could in conscience take, he was whisked away from Oxford. At this point, he was about 16. And he may have spent some time in Cambridge. He then went to London. He attended the Inns of Court, where he studied law but didn't plan to be a lawyer. And basically, he seems to have been intending to be a courtier, to get some kind of preferment through being a highly intelligent and polyglot and learned person. And he embarked in a fairly promising way on that career when he joined the household of the Lord Privy Seal, George Egerton. But fortunately or unfortunately for Donne, Egerton's wife's brother, if I remember this set of relationships correctly, exchanged children with Egerton. Egerton's son went and lived with the brother's family in a very nice Tudor manor in the countryside. And More's, M-O-R-E's daughter, Anne More, who was then 14, went to stay in the Egerton household at about the time that Donne was taking up employment as one of Egerton's secretaries. Donne styles himself Egerton's chief secretary at one point, but it seems unlikely that he actually was the chief secretary. Egerton had several, and he later reproved Donne for improving his prose without his permission, something that's very dangerous for secretaries to do, clearly. And Donne and this young woman at some point in the next few years fell in love with each other. She's 14. Well, over the next few years.
Gotcha.
And we don't know exactly the sequence of events, but in 1601, they married secretly with several of Donne's friends as witnesses.
So without the father's...
Without the father's permission, without the uncle's permission, without the uncle or father's knowledge, but...
Was it a Catholic wedding?
No. This was a wedding in a British church. Anne More was not Catholic, so that their wedding was not a Catholic service. Not that the two services are all that different.
Right, sure. I just don't know. I'm just curious when he switches sides.
Oh, quite a few years after this.
Okay, so he's still a Catholic.
So he's still a Catholic, sort of. But if you remember Satire 3, Donne explores doubts about religion in a lot of his poetry. He was a skeptical, investigative, intellectual in his religious life as he was in every other aspect of his life, as far as we can tell. And his commitment to Catholicism clearly was strong, since it was very inconvenient to him and he didn't renounce it. And it was part of his relation to his family, who seemed to have been dear to him. It was shaken in the 1590s when his younger brother Henry, who had accompanied him to Oxford and whom he was very close to, was arrested in the company of a man called Harrington, who was accused of being a priest, not a Jesuit, but a Church of Rome instigator attempting to convert or pervert Londoners. Harrington was hanged until almost dead and then taken down from the gallows and drawn and quartered. Henry, who was confined in prison, died of some ailment. But nonetheless, this was a kind of terrifying warning for Donne of what could easily happen to you if you were Catholic. Donne had also visited in the company of his mother, when he was a child, Jasper Heywood, who was in the Tower of London under threat of same sort of dismal fate. Didn't happen because Jasper Heywood was a childhood friend of Queen Elizabeth's. And so he appealed to her, and she eventually got him out of there, and he moved to the continent and never came back to England. Heywood is known as an early translator of Seneca. He was a very learned person that seemed to run in Donne's family. Obviously, Sir Thomas More was an extremely learned person, and all the women in More's family were famous for their unusual female erudition. Donne's wife was, as far as we can tell from the rather brief comments on her that appear in some of his friends' letters, was learned as well, but we don't know whether she was polyglot the way Margaret Roper or other relatives of Sir Thomas More's were. Anyhow, sorry, I'm digressing a bit. Donne suffered greatly for this rash marriage. He was fired, he was imprisoned, his wife was sent into the country, but he had, in fact, provided...
he was imprisoned?
He was imprisoned, yeah.
I mean, was it illegal?
Well, he was accused of betraying the household he was part of, and I don't know if there was a charge. I mean, that is, I'm not sure there needed to be a charge when you were messing with important people like Egerton. But he was probably accused of seducing a minor because she was still
that's kind of about 18. Yeah, that's kind of, I just wasn't sure what the laws were there.
But Donne had actually expected static, and he had extremely carefully arranged a court hearing that would establish that he was thoroughly married, that the marriage was entirely legal, that it had been consummated, and that thus it was irrevocable. It could not be dissolved, because he knew that it was not unlikely that the father at least would attempt to dissolve it. And that happened. The dissolution failed. The court case for Donne's legally being married held up. And there was a kind of a retraction of hostilities, but there was no return to Egerton's employment. And so Donne endured a long period of poverty and uncertainty about employment that continued really for the first decade and a half of the 17th century.
How long is he separated from his wife?
Well, once it's established that they're married, she joins him.
Okay.
And she immediately starts having children.
Okay.
And she is either pregnant or recovering from a pregnancy or both for the rest of their marriage until she dies of a stillbirth and the consequences of it. They have, if I remember correctly, 10 children in 12 years or so.
Sounds about right.
Yeah. And of whom I think 7 survive. So there is this extraordinary story about Donne, Donne's life, which is told first and told well by Isaac Walton in his Life of Donne. Isaac Walton is the author of The Complete Angler. He was a member of Donne's congregation in St. Paul's and loved Donne as a preacher. He's considerably younger than Donne. And he wrote a Life of Donne that is partial basis for biography continually amended. It's sort of a hagiographical piece. But anyway, he writes about the marriage and the consequences of it. And as Donne sought various kinds of employment, he kept being offered positions in the church. And for quite a while, he turned them down, with the reason being given that scandals in his past, that is his marriage, but also probably his love poetry and his Catholic family heritage. I mean, in order to be offered a position in the church, he had to have already, to some extent, been perceived as having adopted the Church of England, which he clearly had done at some point, but the exact moment is not entirely clear. And in the end, he acquiesced, but the offer came from King James. I mean, he held back from various offers of relatively minor positions in the church. And then James, who knew what a great preacher he would be, said, I'm going to make you Dean of St. Paul's. He invited him to dinner at Hampton Court, I think, and said, this is going to happen.
This is St. Paul's in London,
yes,
right?
This is the cathedral, the Bishop of London, but the dean is the presiding divine in the cathedral itself and is in sort of in charge of it. And from then on, from 1615 to his death in the early 1630s, Donne was the charismatic preacher in St. Paul's, and a very important and also pretty wealthy person. So his transition from impecunious love poet, martyr to love, because he seems to have been faithful to his wife in the first decade or so of the 16th century, to famous divine, and fairly soon after that, after he became Dean of St. Paul's, he became a widower, but he did not remarry. He remained ardently faithful to his wife's memory. So it's an exciting life from the point of view of a sacred and profane love podcast.
Yes.
And we don't have dates for most of Donne's poems. Sometimes they mention some circumstance that allows us to date them. But his love poems...
Is that because he's not publishing them?
He's not publishing them.
Okay.
And in fact, they seem to have been sort of cast by him on the waters. They were very, very frequently copied and commonplaced by his contemporaries. There are many, many variants of most of them, so that biography of Donne says every edition of Donne ought to say poems by John Donne as pieced together from fragments by X, where X is the editor, because there are many, many, many different manuscripts that contain what seem to be poems by Donne. And his poems were published after his death by his son, John Donne Jr., who also published his sermons. And so from that point on, we have something like a Donne canon, but manuscript study of verse from the 1590s and so on yields tons of poems and variants of poems by Donne that were circulating.
Yeah, so in terms of his canon, there's a lot of different kinds of poems, it seems to me, but then also epigrams and sermons and letters. But there's the love poems, but then there's the divine poems, the holy sonnets. And then some of his sermons, I read his final sermon. What is it? Death's Duel? It was incredibly striking and moving. Yeah.
They are. And I think one thing we could do for your listeners is read some of these poems out so you get a sense of Donne's flavor and, as ventriloquized by my voice, his voice being one of the distinctive features of his poems. And without being too professorial about it, one should say that the 16th century English love lyrics have tended to be Petrarchan, even though they could often be biting as well. And Donne is, like Shakespeare in his sonnets, somebody who's both aware of this tradition and in conscious dissent from it. He has a whole variety of attitudes toward love and toward women. He's a very strongly heterosexual love poet. And I thought I might begin by reading a poem called Woman's Constancy, which is alphabetically, at least, the last poem in the Songs and Sonnets. Now thou hast loved me one whole day. Tomorrow, when thou leavest, what wilt thou say? Wilt thou then antedate some new-made vow, or say that now we are not just those persons which we were? Or that oaths made in reverential fear of love and his wrath any may forswear? Or, as true deaths, true marriages untie, so lovers' contracts, images of those, bind but till sleep, death's image, them unloose. Or, your own end to justify, for having purposed change and falsehood, you can have no way but falsehood to be true. Vain lunatic, against these scapes I could dispute and conquer if I would, which I abstain to do, for by tomorrow I may think so too. So it's both a wonderfully playful poem and, as is characteristic of Donne, a very strenuous piece of argument. I mean, you can read it over and over again and keep discovering new patterns in it. And it's clear from the opening line that to have loved somebody for one whole day is seen by Donne as actually quite a surprising thing to happen in the context of this particular poem.
Why is it called Woman's Constancy?
Because it's addressed to a woman. And because it is describing how, from the point of view of this poem and this mood, Donne regards women's attitude toward constancy. It was a classic form of misogyny to say that women were less constant than men, even though we all know that they're more constant than men.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I was wondering, is this to a particular woman or...
Probably not.
Right.
I mean, this is not a morning after poem, I don't think. This is a poem to entertain probably a largely male audience of readers with a set of ideas about brief love relations.
Mm-hmm.
Let me read another poem just to give a sense of Donne's variety of attitudes toward women. This is a poem called Break of Day. It's one of Donne's relatively few poems in a woman's voice. I mean, he has a pretty wonderful Ovidian fictive verse letter like the Heroides called Sappho to Philaenis, which is in Sappho's voice. But this is in the voice of some woman who is addressing her lover. And she says, "'Tis true, 'tis day, what though it be? Oh, wilt thou therefore rise from me? Why should we rise because 'tis light? Did we lie down because 'twas night? Love, which in spite of darkness brought us hither, should in despite of light keep us together. Light hath no tongue, but is all eye. If it could speak as well as spy, this were the worst that it could say, that being well I fain would stay, and that I loved my heart and honor so, that I would not from him that had them go. Must business thee from hence remove? Oh, that's the worst disease of love. The poor, the foul, the false love can admit, but not the busied man. He which hath business and makes love doth do such wrong as when a married man doth woo." It's a beautiful poem, I think, and it articulates a ardent woman's attitude or perspective, which is one of Donne's great gifts as a love poet. That is, those who laud him as a great love lyricist are doing so partly because he has poems that enact a feeling of mutual fulfillment in love, which is relatively unusual in love poetry. I mean, a lot of love poetry is about pursuit and conquest and idolization of the beloved and the beloved's appearance and the beloved as a ladder to perfection, a whole set of attitudes filtered through Petrarch, perhaps ultimately from Plato's Symposium or someplace like that. But Donne's poems that people focus on, and I haven't begun with them, as the epitome of Donne's fabulousness as a love poet, are poems where he is actually in conversation with a beloved to whom he feels committed and from whom he feels commitment. And I thought I'd start there with a poem that isn't as famous as many, and I can't remember whether I included it in the little anthology of PDFs I sent to you or not. I think I didn't, but I thought of it.
It's okay. I've got the whole thing
You
here.
got the whole
so
thing
we
here,
can,
right.
Yeah.
It's called Lover's Infiniteness.
Oh, that's a great one.
Yeah.
I don't remember, but I did read that.
Yeah. And like many of these poems, it's addressed from a man who seems to be Donne. Which Donne is a question. Donne wrote in a depressed period after his marriage, but before his employment, a treatise, extremely learned treatise called Biathanatos about suicide.
Oh.
And he kept it secret, and he sent it to one of his best friends whom he trusted, a man named Kerr, with a message that said, "Please keep this." I think he said, "You may read it if you wish, but please don't let anybody else read it. And when I'm dead, decide what you want to do with it, but don't publish it because it might tarnish my reputation, even posthumously." And it's this argument that even though suicide is prescribed by the church and the legal system, suicides were supposed to have their bodies desecrated as punishment. I mean, it seems weird to be punishing people who've already committed suicide, but, buried with a stake through their heart at a crossroads, which means their spirit has trouble escaping. Or in France, dragged face downward through the streets. Donne believed that there was the possibility that if a suicide were undertaken in the right spirit, not the spirit of despairing of God's grace, but rather a spirit of affirming somehow God's grace. And he sees various martyrs in the history of the church as basically choosing martyrdom in a way that is indistinguishable from suicide, except that it's not prescribed, right? It's rather exalted. And then he suggests—
I want to read this.
Well,
You'll
it's
have to
long.
send it to me.
And then he goes so far as to suggest that since Christ had, on the cross, clearly had the power to choose how long he would survive, and was survived by the people on either side of him who were also crucified, he had in fact probably chosen death, having made his peace with things. You can see why Donne didn't particularly want this to be in wide circulation when he was Dean of St. Paul's, or even when he was—
Well, and it's so interesting that he wrote this in a most depressive state. I mean—
Yeah, well, he was
he
clearly
trying to—
thinking about what was permitted and what wasn't. It's not exactly like Montaigne's On a Custom of the Isle of Sia, where he's actually thinking about Stoic suicide. Donne is thinking more about Christian suicide and trying to reconcile it. Anyway,
Right.
I've forgotten how I got to this. Oh, yes. In the letter, he says to Kerr, he says, "This is the work of Jack Donne, not Dr. Donne."
I see.
And the idea that there is actually a kind of a distinction in the works of Donne between the works of Jack Donne, who is the author of saucy love poems.
Jack is the profane.
Jack is the profane, right? And Dr. Donne is the sacred.
The sacred.
Right.
Gotcha.
But as I hope you're about to hear, many of Donne's love poems have about them the intensity and commitment that we might also expect from a great sermon. And I'm not sure whether I would class Lover's Infiniteness in this way. I think Lover's Infiniteness is mostly fascinating because it illustrates something about Donne's commitment to argument about love and to the way in which the assumptions in which we come to love— I mean, in this case, I'm talking about ordinary human love between two people— the assumptions in which we come to love have a huge impact on what the quality of our love is going to turn out to be. And if we come with base or inadequate assumptions, we may be, in effect, condemning ourselves to an inadequate experience with other people.
I think that's exactly correct.
Yeah, I mean, I think any of our listeners can probably resonate to that sentiment to some degree. So Lover's Infiniteness is about that problem, and it is playing with the idea of how the Petrarchan courtly lover approaches his exalted, pedestal raised, beautiful mistress by making her offerings of poems and sighs and tears and letters and so on. The man sees the beautiful, inaccessible woman. He falls in love. He says, he feels immediately completely cut off from all former pleasures. And he tries to get mercy, and eventually mercy might turn into love from the beloved. So this is Donne playing with that concept of how it's supposed to work.
And also having a quarrel with it, or just playing with it?
Illustrating its inadequacy, I would say. Not quarreling with it, but worrying about it. "If yet I have not all thy love, dear, I shall never have it all. I cannot breathe one other sigh to move, nor can entreat one other tear to fall. All my treasure, which should purchase thee, sighs, tears, and oaths and letters I have spent, Yet no more can be due to me than at the bargain made was meant. If then thy gift of love were partial, that some to me, some should to others fall, dear, I shall never have thee all. Then a space between stanzas. Often a lot happens in spaces between stanzas in Donne. And in this case, I think we can presume that the woman being addressed has at least made a face and possibly lodged an objection. Or, if then thou gavest me all was but all which thou hadst then. But if in thy heart since there be or shall new love created be by other men, which have their stocks entire, and can in tears, in sighs, in oaths and letters outbid me, this new love may beget new fears, for this love was not vowed by thee. And yet it was. Thy gift being general, the ground, thy heart, is mine. Whatever shall grow there, dear, I should have it all. Then another stanza break. And we can see the way this poem is structured so far on partial turning to general. And then he goes on, yet I would not have all yet. He that hath all can have no more. And since my love doth every day admit new growth, thou shouldst have new rewards in store. Thou canst not every day give me thy heart. If thou canst give it, then thou never gavest it. Love's riddles are that though thy heart depart, it stays at home, and thou with losing savest it. But we will have a way more liberal than changing hearts to join them. So we shall be one, and one another's all. And this is, I think, a gorgeous poem, but its beauty lies in the strength of its observation and argument rather than in striking images.
Right.
Or, I mean, it is witty in that it is sort of disemboweling the Petrarchan convention that a man wins a woman's love by giving her all these things, sighs, oaths, tears, letters, poems, and thus buys her love and makes a bargain with her that it should then govern their feelings from then on. But it also moves from I to we in an absolutely critical way at the end of the poem. Donne was an expert on the law, among many other things he was expert on. And so he's talking about possession of property and how the idea of possession is actually inadequate to the idea of love.
Right.
It's not a mode of possession. Lovers are not one another's property, exactly. They need some more liberal concept than that. But a more liberal concept is probably going to be paradoxical.
Well, I know there's one poem where he talks about the lovers sort of creating their own world.
Yeah.
I can't remember which one that was.
It's probably,
but I loved that one.
Yeah. It could be the sun rising. It could be the good morrow. Let me read you the good morrow. I should stress I'm not reading it to you exactly, or not reading it at you. But this is a poem that every reader of Donne thinks what must have been written to Anne Moore and must have been written early in their relationship, but after they were together.
Oh, yes. This is the poem I'm thinking of. Oh,
Good.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder, by my troth, what thou and I did till we loved. Were we not weaned till then, but sucked on country pleasures childishly? Or snorted we in the seven sleepers' den? 'Twas so. But this, all pleasure's fancies be. If ever any beauty I did see which I desired and got, 'twas but a dream of thee. And now good morrow to our waking souls, which watch not one another out of fear, for love all love of other sights controls, and makes one little room and everywhere. Let sea discoverers to new worlds have gone. Let maps to others worlds on worlds have shown. Let us possess one world. Each hath one and is one. My face in thine eye, thine in mine appears, and true plain hearts do in the faces rest. Where can we find two better hemispheres without sharp north, without declining west? Whatever dies was not mixed equally. If our two loves be one, or thou and I love so alike that none do slacken, none can die. I think that final conceit probably does need a little explanation. That one of the medical ideas that Donne is invoking here is the idea that we decay, fall apart because our temperaments are not perfectly balanced, right?
Sure.
Our humors are not in perfect balance with each other. If they were, we would live as long as Methuselah or longer. But alas, none of us is perfectly mixed, and so we do die. This is not frequently cited as one of Donne's great poems about sexual love, but it clearly is a poem about sexual love in that the idea of making one little room and everywhere is referring not only to their bedroom, but also to one another's bodies. And there's also one of the things that makes Donne, I think, a hyper-masculine poet who has always appealed to many, many discerning women readers, is that he is fully admitting the female partner into the delectation of an experienced person when he says, were we not weaned till then, but sucked on childish pleasures, country pleasures childishly. He does say about himself, if ever any beauty I did see which I desired and got, 'twas but a dream of thee, implying that he probably came to the relationship with more experience than she, which certainly have been the case with Anne Moore, given that she was like 16 or so when they started loving each other.
Well, I think also right now we're reading Dante in my honors class. And obviously all of Dante's poems to Beatrice she's this very distant, literally iconic figure. And it is very difficult for students to understand that precisely because we don't see that distanced idealization as relatable to them. And I think Donne would be more relatable to them in the sense that he is talking about an experience that they can relate back to themselves. I think in a way that like courtly love is just deeply alien.
I think that's true. And I think it was true for Donne's readers then as well as now.
Sure.
That there's a kind of immediacy and appropriability about Donne's love poems that makes us want to inhabit them, to perform them, and to aspire to the states of relation that they sometimes describe, although there are a lot of poems of disillusion and anger and humor and so on.
Yeah, some of them are quite funny.
Yeah.
What is it? The one about the mistress going to bed? That one's quite funny. I was laughing out loud a lot. You know what I'm talking about.
That's the elegy on his mistress.
Yes.
Right. Oh, my America, my newfound land.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
We were, my husband and I were reading Donne to one another last night, and we were hysterical.
Yeah. No, that is
absolutely hysterical. We had to stop for a while.
Yeah. Well, let me read a poem that is one of the truly great ones. This is Love's Growth, which is also known as Spring.
Yes.
That is both abundantly erotic and wonderfully committed, I think. And also, here we are near Easter, it's spring.
Yes, it's a lovely spring day.
I scarce believe my love to be as pure as I had thought it was, because it doth endure vicissitude and season as the grass. Methinks I lied all winter when I swore my love was infinite, if spring make it more. But if this medicine, love, which cures all sorrow with more, not only be no quintessence, but mixed of all stuffs, painting soul or sense, and of the sun his working vigor borrow, love's not so pure and abstract as they used to say, which have no mistress but their muse, but as all else, being elemented too, love sometimes would contemplate, sometimes do. And yet, not greater, but more eminent, love by the spring is grown, as in the firmament stars by the sun are not enlarged, but shown. Gentle love deeds as blossoms on a bough, from love's awakened root do bud out now. If, as in water stirred, more circles be produced by one, love such additions take, those like so many spheres but one heaven make, for they are all concentric unto thee. And though each spring do add to love new heat, as princes do in times of action get new taxes and remit them not in peace, no winter shall abate the spring's increase. One of the beautiful things about this poem is the way it comes to be addressed, to have an addressee of an explicit grammatical kind, very late. Mm-hmm. So that it sounds like a meditation aimed at other poets when he says, love's not so pure and abstract as they used to say, which have no mistress but their muse. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly it turns out to be a love poem addressed to the beloved who is present and who is listening and who centers this whole meditation, including the idea that princes raise taxes in times of war and don't remit them in times of peace. Right. And maybe that can be an emblem of how our love is going to keep growing and growing and growing right. and never shrink, right. like the national debt.
Right.
Yeah.
So should we, I'm just looking at the time,
yes.
should we talk about some of the more divine poems?
Yes.
Just to give listeners a flavor of that sort of love poem.
Yes, indeed. I was thinking that we might want to read the Hymn to Christ on the author's last going into Germany and the Hymn to God, my God.
Hymn to God, my God, in my sickness.
Yeah, which is usually thought to be one of Donne's last poems. One of the great features of the Hymn to Christ is that it kind of brings together Donne's experience as a love poet with his experience
as a divine. So this is a hymn to Christ?
Yeah. So Donne was, after he'd become Dean of St. Paul's, he was asked to go as the chaplain on a mission directed by a friend of his as ambassador, sent by James I to try to prevent the 30 Years' War, basically.
Oh, okay.
He was sent, he went to Germany, loosely speaking, to Bohemia, to try to avert this conflict, which was a complete failure.
Obviously failed.
Failed, right. And Donne didn't particularly want to do this, and he writes this poem before he went, although I think Donne himself made sort of a success of this trip. In what torn ship soever I embark, that ship shall be my emblem of thy ark. What sea soever swallow me, that flood shall be to me an emblem of thy blood. Though thou with clouds of anger do disguise thy face, yet through that mask I know those eyes, which, though they turn away sometimes, they never will despise. I sacrifice this island unto thee, and all whom I loved there and who loved me. When I have put our seas twixt them and me, put thou thy sea betwixt my sins and thee. As the tree's sap doth seek the root below in winter, in my winter now I go where none but thee, the eternal root of true love, I may know. Nor thou, nor thy religion doth control the amorousness of an harmonious soul, but thou wouldst have that love thyself. As thou art jealous, Lord, so I am jealous now. Thou lovest not, till from loving more thou free my soul. Whoever gives takes liberty. Or, if thou carest not whom I love, alas, thou lovest not me. Seal then this bill of my divorce to all on whom those fainter beams of love did fall. Marry those loves, which in youth scattered be on fame, wit, hopes, false mistresses, to thee. Churches are best for prayer that have least light. To see God only I go out of sight, and to scape stormy days I choose an everlasting night. And we can see, if you remember the poem I was reading just before we turned to the divine poems, and I started fumbling to try to find this one, you can see that the same actual train of images is there in Love's Growth. Mm-hmm. The idea of the root, the idea of winter bringing the sap back down to the root and then the sap rising in the spring. There's a wonderful image of that in one of Donne's great elegiac poems, Nocturnal on St. Lucy's Day, where he seems to be mourning somebody, probably Lucy, Countess of Bedford. He says, "The world's whole sap is sunk. The general balm the hydroptic earth hath drunk. Whither as to the bed's feet life is shrunk." So you have the sense of, in the wintertime, people snuggling down under the covers so that they end up at the very bottom of the bed, completely covered up to try to get out of the cold. And here, when he describes the tree's sap seeking the root below in winter, and he in his winter now separating himself from everything that he has loved that is not God, in order to go someplace where there will be nobody that he loves except God. And then he ends up with that very striking, churches are best for prayer that have least light, which is an image I've always loved. Mm-hmm. So,
I mean, how do you think that he understands the relation between his profane observations and his profane loves and his sacred loves and duties? Does he ever discuss this in his letters or his sermons, or can we extract a thesis?
I think we can extract something like a thesis from the poem I just read, where he talks about the amorousness of an harmonious soul being something that neither God nor Christianity controls in the sense of setting limits on. That is, it is not the intention of God nor the intention of the church that the soul should have only one object of love. It is the amorousness of an harmonious soul is permitted to range among the objects of the world as long as they're kept in a due proportion. Yeah.
Sure.
And I think that Donne tends in these poems to present his spiritual life as a gradual renunciation of some of those objects in favor of others. But at the same time, he has the not uncommon 17th century Protestant anxieties about whether he himself sustains the right degree of ardent faith to convince himself that he's not reprobate. And so we get poems like Holy Sonnet 14, Batter My Heart, Three-Person God, where he asks God to ravish him, I can read that, in order to completely take him over and keep his mind from misleading him, taking him away. I mean, Donne as a poet of religion is a poet who's constantly seeking and is somewhat anxious about whether he has achieved the kind of peace with God that he wishes he had, that he thinks other people may have.
Well, I wonder if that anxiety and that tension was heightened for him by the fact that he's raised a Catholic, where if you're a cleric, you are celibate, you are not married, you are not divided in that way, right? If you have a vocation to religious life, that vow of chastity, perfect chastity, and poverty is meant to keep you holy, right? To literally in the sense of set apart from the things of the world. And I just wonder if he's still working through that Catholic heritage as a Protestant divine.
It could be, if you'll permit me this observation. I mean, one of the strengths of Donne's love poetry is that on the whole, it seems completely absent sexual guilt. I mean, there is occasional regret about sex, but there isn't any sense that, oh my God, I've sinned.
But I'm not talking about sexual guilt. I'm talking about
Sure,
being
no,
divided.
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
But I would have thought that if Donne sustained a sense that a true Christian vocation would be a celibate one.
No, but that's not, sorry.
That's not what you meant either.
No,
Okay.
any Christian has a true Christian vocation. It is the call to religious life, which from a Catholic perspective is a call to perfect chastity, whether you are a man or a woman. It is a call to be set apart so that you are not, as sometimes St. Paul suggests, you might be divided in this way. You don't have this anxiety about whether you're fully devoted to God because of the duties of domestic life, because you have fully given yourself to Christ and his church. So it's not about a Christian vocation per se, but just a vocation to religious life, since he is, right? He is a cleric. I'm just wondering if he's still working through that Catholic.
Well,
for him at this point, I assume baggage. Let's assume that he's wholeheartedly Protestant.
Yeah. To draw something from your question is kind of interesting from that point of view, that most of Donne's life as a cleric, he is in fact a widower. He is separated from that phase of his life. He is looking after his children, but other people are to some degree helping him with that. And he is consecrating himself pretty completely to his religious vocation, it seems. But
so he's celibate.
So he is celibate.
Yeah.
I mean, he
Okay.
does seem to have been, Walton says he was. We assume that he was, just because he seems like somebody who wouldn't conceal it if he weren't. And
so then the more sacred poems, are those later in his life when he is celibate?
yeah, probably.
Okay.
That is a little bit artificial to say, okay, all the love poems are by young Jack Donne and all the religious poems are by Dr. John Donne.
But is it true? I mean, but is that mostly the case?
There are poems like this one, which is Holy Sonnet 19, which is one of my favorite of the Holy Sonnets, in which it sounds as though Donne was wrestling with these issues of commitment and internal consistency and the impossibility of us achieving a kind of serenity in vocation, certainly when he's writing this poem. But I'm going to read in a little while what seems to be almost his last poem, Hymn to God, my sickness, in which he's still saying this same sort of thing. But this is a holy sonnet that is as vexed around issues of faith and doubt as, say, many poems by Herbert.
Excellent. Let's dive in.
Oh, to vex me, contraries meet in one. Inconstancy unnaturally hath begot a constant habit, that when I would not, I change in vows and in devotion. As humorous is my contrition as my profane love, and as soon forgot, as riddlingly distempered, cold and hot, as praying, as mute, as infinite, as none. I durst not view heaven yesterday, and today in prayers and flattering speeches I court God. Tomorrow I quake with true fear of his rod. So my devout fits come and go away like a fantastic ague. Save that here, those are my best days when I shake with fear. Well, that's not the sentiment of somebody who has achieved serenity. And if we go to the hymn to God the Father, which we think of as, one of the poems that he wrote as he was approaching death.
Mm-hmm.
Wilt thou forgive, he addresses God, wilt thou forgive that sin where I begun, which is my sin, though it were done before? Wilt thou forgive those sins through which I run, and do run still, though still I do deplore? When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more. Wilt thou forgive that sin by which I have won others to sin, and made my sin their door? Wilt thou forgive that sin which I did shun a year or two, but wallowed in a score? When thou hast done, thou hast not done, for I have more. I have a sin of fear, that when I have spun my last thread, I shall perish on the shore. Swear by thyself that at my death thy sun shall shine as he shines now and heretofore, and having done that thou hast done, I fear no more. It's a great poem, and a poem which targets the faith and the serenity and the strength in facing death and judgment that Walton says Donne had, that Donne seems to have had as he approached death, theatrical as he was about it, sleeping in his coffin and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a wonderful testimony both to his anxieties and to his trust in God's coming to meet him where he needs him most. So
I really appreciated that in the poems that you sent me to talk about, that you sent me both the more profane and the more sacred. I mean, I sort of see them as obviously the work of the same poet and the same mind and perfectly consonant with one another. And I love that. We have to wrap this up. So I have a final question for you, which is about Donne's reception, especially today. I was thinking about what my children might think listening to John Donne. And I have teenagers. I also have younger children. But I feel like they would initially find him off-putting or archaic. I, of course, find him delightful, but am able to enter into the context. What do you think the relevance of Donne is today, just for ordinary people and maybe even young people in particular?
Well, there are some poems, Donne's The Flea is probably the most famous of them, which seem like hooks designed to capture a young person's imagination because they're so cool.
Mm-hmm. My husband loves that one.
Yeah, it is great.
That was the first question he asked me. He was like, "Are you reading The Flea?" I'm like, "No,
and we haven't
not."
read The Flea, but I mean, The Flea is one of those poems where it's clear that Donne and the mistress are face to face.
That's right.
And there is this flea, right? Mark but this flea, and mark in this how little that thou deniest me is. That is, you're refusing to have sex with me. But this flea is actually sucked my blood, and it's about to suck your blood, and that's more than you're letting us do. And then in between the second and the third stanza, the mistress crushes the flea.
She kills it.
Right. And he says, cruel and sudden, hast thou since sullied thy nail in blood of innocence? I'm quoting from memory. I'm not sure I get it exactly right. And then he says, from this you can see how you ought to allow me to seduce you right now, because you're not harmed by the fact that this flea has been killed.
It's a bad argument.
It's not a good argument, no. But it's a cool poem, although it's also a kind of a gross poem from the point of view of people who aren't used to having parasites all over them the way Londoners in the 16th and 17th century were. I've taught Donne to freshmen and sophomores with mixed success. I mean, that's teaching the whole Songs and Sonnets as a book. And it seemed, in fact, to be a kind of a touchstone for whether students had a literary sensibility or not, whether they got excited by this, because we're not usually educating students in how to read a poem very well in high school and before in contemporary America, nor did we when I was a high school student a long time ago. And whether Donne is the ideal poet with whom to acquire that sense of what it means to understand a poem, care about it, inhabit it, perform it, enter, try to be in its voice for some purpose of your own. For contemporary readers, I'm not sure, just because there is a barrier of access in the range of learned references that is everywhere in Donne, that makes it a little bit hard for people to
It's not a
instantly get into
barrier
it.
for Dante, though. They can get right into that.
Yeah.
At least the Divine Comedy.
Well, yeah. T.S. Eliot says you can appreciate the Divine Comedy before you understand it.
Yes, exactly.
And in Donne's case, I think it's hard to appreciate Donne without understanding him, because he's not mellifluous. On the whole, he's actually hard to read. You have to know where the sentence is going.
Yes.
in
You
order
are
to
a beautiful reader of Donne, and just a contrast to what I was doing last evening.
Well, it's hard. I'm reading poems that I have read aloud many times before, and you have to know where you're going in order to make the syntax make sense. Ben Jonson said that Donne should be, I've forgotten what punishment he was going to give Donne, but for failure to observe meter. And Coleridge has this famous quatrain, with Donne, whose muse on dromedary trots, wreathe iron pokers into true love knots. Wits sturdy cripple, learning's press and screw. And then I can't remember what the fourth line is, but he basically is describing what it feels like from him to read Donne. And Coleridge is pretty well equipped to read Donne, really, in comparison with most of our undergraduate students. So yeah, he's not easy, but his reception in the rest of the 17th century was very, very strong. I mean, he and Ben Jonson were the great poets whose followers were writing poetry all the way up to the Restoration and beyond.
Well, what about his reputation today? I mean...
Well, I think it's still very high. In fact, this new book by Catherine Rundell, Super Infinite, which is a biography and meditation on Donne.
It's a bestseller.
It's been well, so the front page says,
Yeah.
But it's very good. And I think it has probably reignited some interest in Donne in Great Britain and may do so in America, let's hope.
Yeah,
So-
2022, so it's fairly recent. Well,
Yeah.
we will put a link to this in the show notes.
Good.
We're out of time, Lars, but this
Okay.
was incredibly delightful.
Thank you. I
Yeah.
enjoyed myself very much. Thank you for your questions.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
Sure.
You have been listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a podcast hosted by the Honors College at the University of Tulsa. To learn more about the Honors College, please go to our website, utulsa.edu/honors. To learn more about this podcast, you can check out its website, sacredandprofanelove.com. On the website, you'll find an archive of all our past episodes and guests, and also a blog where we post news related to the work that we do. You can also follow the podcast on Twitter, where our handle is @eudaimoniapod. Finally, if you would like to support this podcast, you can go to patreon.com/eudaimoniapod. Patrons receive podcast swag and subscriptions with our literary partners, The Point Magazine, Switchyard Magazine, and The Lamp Magazine. We are grateful to our partners for their ongoing support.